And to begin, welcome everybody. I'll introduce myself in a second, but to welcome us all here, I'm going to hand it over to Martha Rands, the head honcho of PLEO, and also the instigator of this event, which obviously there's a lot of interest in. So Martha, take it away.
I like being an instigator. Ideally not quite an insurrectionist, given the current patina on the word insurrectionist. In any event, first, thank everyone for being here. You know, we'd been talking about this for quite some time, over a year, in fact, and had really hoped we'd be able to do this in person with somewhere, how, and we're here. And the beauty of this is that there are so very many of you from literally all corners of the country and into our neighbors to the south. I don't know if there are any international guests, but I welcome all of you to this conversation today. And I have to say, first off, probably one of the more significant parts of the welcome today is to acknowledge that the work that we do is on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And we thank them, all of them, for their forbearance of our presence on their land. I would be remiss if I didn't take one moment or two to thank some of the funders of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society. We started as a little tiny thing called the Artists Legal Outreach almost 17 years ago. And we really wouldn't be here if it weren't for the enlightened support of the City of Vancouver Cultural Services and social planning as well. Now I can say that we're also here with enormous gratitude to Canadian Heritage and the Canada Council for the Arts, who are now we are now in the position of developing the first direct service legal clinic for the arts as part of a national network project where we're going to create what we hope will be 7 legal hubs of information, education, and advice to the arts and culture sector across Canada from coast to coast to coast. And last, the Vancouver Foundation, who are enabling us this fall to pilot the first ever in Canada legal clinic dedicated to the nonprofit sector, of which all of you in some form or other are a part. We really wouldn't be here without many, many hands. I can't even mention them all. Today, I'm very grateful to Marcus for coming in and being our moderator, to the panelists, Yvette Nolan and Mark Friesen, both of whom I hope you will get to know, whether it's Mark's TED Talk or Yvette's article, and to the many, many people who are here because we started kvetching or complaining or talking about boards and the model of most nonprofits in Canada. And it's not really working. Or is it working? We're really not sure because a lot of us are having a lot of issues. And I started thinking hard about this in the last couple of years when I saw board after board, and I'm a lawyer and I advise boards primarily, feeling overwhelmed at the assumption that somehow this motley group of volunteers could solve the funding shortfalls by fundraising, solve the respectful workplaces euphemism for the struggles around interpersonal and conflicts, which are endemic in our sector, or at least they seem endemic to me because I hear about them all the time. And this has nothing to do with the Push Festival. Thank you very much. And last, a legacy. of systemic discrimination that affects everyone at some level, some more than others. And really, we're expecting a lot out of this motley group of folks who are somehow supposed to hold up this edifice of accountability and governance, whatever that means, to the benefit of this, of what I think of as civil society. The thousands and thousands and thousands of people who depend on our work across the nonprofit sector, whether it's working in housing, seniors, health, or the arts. All of us are fundamental to the well-being of our communities, and a lot of is being expected of us. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you today around how do we disrupt this model? Do we disrupt it? The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Awesome. Thank you, Martha. Thank you so much for that and for setting this up. So I'm gonna dive us right in. My name is Marcus Youssef. I'm primarily a playwright. I was the artistic director of New World Theatre here in Vancouver, unceded Coast Salish territories for 15 years. I still make work there, sit on a lot of boards, do a lot of this kind of stuff. It is my honor to be asked and to be here. It's also my honor, and I'm gonna introduce our panelists briefly, and then just talk through the shape of this, which we're imagining will be 60 minutes, maybe 75. We'll see. You know, people will go when they need to go. So I just thrilled with the folks here. Martha has introduced herself to some extent. Everybody knows, or most everybody knows, how deeply she has invested herself through PLEO, through Artist Legal Education Outreach, in the legal and structural and governance questions that are fundamental to so much of what we do. And for many of us, not really what we want to think about, but we in this system are forced to. Everybody also knows that if you have any questions about the Canadian Copyright Act, Martha Rands is the person who will talk to you quite a bit about those questions. So I offered that. Too. So welcome. Thank you, Martha. Our second panelist that I'm going to introduce is one of the artists I admire most in this country. Her name's Yvette Nolan. She's a playwright of many, many, many critically important and kind of canonical works. She was the artistic director of Native Earth Performing Arts Society for a bunch of time in Toronto. She's written one of the canonical books about Indigenous performance in this country. And very excitingly, I think for many of us, she has taken her just deep intellect, her rigorous thought, and also the kindness and generosity of her spirit, which is something I've always responded to with Yvette, into a Master's of Public Policy in Saskatchewan, looking at questions of governance and these exact kind of dilemmas that we know are facing in the sector right now. So it's my extreme pleasure to welcome Yvette to this convo. Yvette, thank you for being here. And then our final conversational participator, I'm trying not to say panelist for some reason, is someone who I've only gotten to know through this process. His name is Mark Friesen, and I've really, really enjoyed it. Mark's the executive director of Columbia Colleges, is one of the longest running private nonprofit educational institutions in the country, and someone who has done a ton of deep thinking, beginning at Vantage Point, where he worked for a while, about the role nonprofits and nonprofit governance, the critical role that plays in the maintenance, sustaining, and also growing of actual democratic relationships and a democratic society. Martha mentioned his TED Talk, Mark Friesen TED Talk. If you look at it, I had the great pleasure of watching it. It's absolutely fantastic, and would suggest that people check it out if they get the chance. Mark, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. So just the shape of it. We got a couple of kind of general questions that I'm going to pose to the panelists, or the whatever participators. And one of the exciting things that has happened, as evidenced by the number of people who've joined us, is Angela, who I will recognize in a second, put out a call for questions. We got like 50 from people. So we're going to try to make a bunch of space to address those questions. Now, one of the ways this is working is because we're all amateur TV producers, as I said, when people are arriving now, live engagement producers. We don't have the capacity to spotlight people and hear people's voices. We just don't. But the opportunity for engagement in this is through the chat. We will, in the third part of the talk, move to people's questions. People can ask new questions there. Martha and Angela will be monitoring those and choosing those questions. We're not going to get to everybody's, of course, but you can also, like when we're talking about what are better models, what in the model is working, what isn't, feel free to dump those things in the chat. That would be really helpful. One of the things that PLEO is doing with this is collating, gathering, and they're gonna do that and produce a kind of document as a kind of continuing and evolving resource in relationship to this question. And so that would be great if people kind of focus their engagement in that way. That would be super helpful. And while I'm here, I'll just throw it to Angela, who, in addition to doing all that work and doing all the logistical work of setting this up, is also going to be troubleshooting any challenges we have technically, which of course we will, because it's this platform. Angela, do you want to say hi quickly?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Marcus mentioned, we will be utilizing the chat for any submission of questions and thoughts. We'd love to keep this chat active and engaging and dynamic, so please submit any and all of your thoughts as the panel continues. And yes, please do bear with us if there are any tech difficulties. If you're experiencing any issues, just privately message myself. We have closed captioning and an ASL interpreter available for any accessibility needs. As well, we have a great law student who's volunteering to take notes for this session, and I'll be following up with a resource indicating any thoughts that were exchanged and any ideas of board models that you all contribute today. And that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I just, before we dive in with our sort of first question for Mark, Martha, and Yvette, I feel like I need to kind of acknowledge something. And this came from one of the questions that was submitted online prior to the event. Somebody said, and I think quite rightly in the question, they said, you know, I know that you guys probably don't want to do this, but it feels like what happened at Push was like a really useful kind of way of talking about some of these challenges. And I would just like to say that I agree that that is true. And I also want to say, and we've talked about this a little amongst ourselves, but I'm really speaking for myself here, is I actually at this moment don't have the capacity to, or really it's not my place, given that I attempted with Michael Yamamoto to do some work to try to help Push with its organizational, its governance, and its managerial problems at the moment. And frankly, that work didn't work in the way we wanted to. I would say it failed. And there's no legal prohibition on me talking about it. But at the moment, actually, I feel like the work I'm doing is just like about individual conversations with people who were affected by the work we attempted to do. And that, for me, is the place I have to come at this from for now. I will say, as I have said, and Michael and I have said from the very beginning, that we think it is critically important that the community get an opportunity to talk about what happened, and that is, in our view, and only our view, will be a necessary part of the process of Push becoming whatever it is that it next is meant to become. So that's kind of my perspective on that. And I hope those opportunities that the organization or the community in some way is able to make those opportunities happen. It's so weird speaking to hundreds of people about something like that in the Zoom context, I will say, but I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so moving into the panel, Yvette, Martha, Mark. So as I said, we got a couple of basic questions. Oh, sorry, no, I forgot our intros. I'm sorry, have you guys got your intros ready? I completely forgot about that. Are you ready for your little opening statements? Yeah, I'm sorry. So actually the first thing is everybody, and I'm gonna be quite strict about time with this. And we've agreed this. I'm gonna give everybody 3 minutes because I like time limitations. Because, you know, if people don't finish, there's a bit of mystery, right? And drama benefits from mystery. So I'm going to give everybody, our 3 panelists, 3 minutes, just to kind of like as a statement about what they're thinking about right now in relationship to these questions, these critical questions of governance. And I didn't tell you guys the order first, but I'm going to ask Yvette, are you willing to go first?
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, I got my little timer here.
And so do I, Marcus, because I've been in your group before.
Very good.
Hi, everybody. Yvette Nolan, as Marcus has said, my name is Yvette. I'm a playwright, director, and dramaturg. I ran Native Earth for 8 years from 2003 to 11 in Toronto. And then I did some work, and then I decided to go back to school. So I went back to school 3 years ago to Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy to work on my bête noire, which is the board of directors. So as long as I've been in professional theater, which is 30 years, I have struggled with the board of directors. So I went back to school to get some tools and to see if I could make change in that way, because obviously making change from the inside is like not working. My original thesis that I pitched when I went to school was that the board of directors is actually a fiction, that there is no there. And some of you will have read the Mass Culture article, and that's kind of what I say. There is no there. That this structure, this model that was taken whole cloth from the profit system and imposed on the nonprofit system just doesn't work. It's a one size fits no one kind of model of governance. My thinking has changed a little bit because of this. When I went to school, and people knew I was working on this idea, the board of directors, people from all over the country called me and said, you need to talk to me about what is wrong with the board of directors model. And everyone had a terrible story. So it's a bit like unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. Well, the board of directors model is failing in its own, every single one fails in every single personal way. So, which leads me to the step back and go, okay, so it is not actually the board of directors, this board of directors or that board of directors. It is the structure that is failing us. And therefore, what can we do about it? When I started my research, it was an abstract idea, and my supervisor was like, yeah, okay, so the board of directors, but what model are you going to do and how are you going to do it? And it was an abstract idea. But then the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the neo-civil rights movement, and suddenly it's no longer an abstract idea, it's actually a practical idea because we are in the change moment. The things that drive me crazy, there's so many, I could spend the entire time talking about it. But the fact that, the for-profit model is about stakeholders, and how they measure things is through money and profit. And when you apply that to the nonprofit side, there's no measurement. In theater, how do we measure that? And who gets to do that? Bums in seats, subscriptions, number of plays, bricks and mortar, those are the metrics. And the fact that it's, as Marcus has pointed out, a volunteer board of directors who is ultimately both responsible and not responsible. And we're in the moment where everybody wants more brown board members without having made any systemic change that is going to help those members succeed or make change. I'm done.
Awesome. And we're not done with you. Just to be clear, this is just a little taste.
I'm going to go with my lunch
before we get into actual conversation. Thank you so much, Yvette. So much work you've done. Just to remind everybody, I posted links to Yvette's article at the very top of the chat, and they'll be available elsewhere. Next, again, just for a little bite-sized introduction, that's all we're talking about here. I'm going to go to Mark Friesen, who, as I said, has been just such a pleasure to get to know and learn from in the lead up to this process. Mark, take it away. You got your 3 minutes.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And wow, Yvette, you've set the bar, so appreciate that fully. So I'll dive. This notion of the board as a fiction, very much reinforced in my own experience in the nonprofit sector. And I'm ecstatic that there's this many people today interested in this topic that a few of us in the province have been thinking about for a while. And now it's like, whoa, 300 people, governance, let's do it. Just some framing that I found useful recently is a distinction. And I take this from the Ontario Nonprofit Network that'll be valuable, I think, for all of you if you're thinking about your own organization. The board is not the same as governance. And I'm pausing for dramatic effect. Okay, nonprofits are governed by several things, including the board, but oftentimes we don't make that distinction. We assume, oh, governance, now I'm talking about a board, a group of people sitting in a room, Robert's Rules of Order. Not necessarily. Nonprofits are governed by legislation. They're governed by funders. Members have a say. The community where they work have a say. Artists arguably have a say or influence. And we can talk about that. So when it comes to governance, it may be valuable to think, okay, for my organization, what is our goal in governance and what does governance look like? And then to say, based on that, okay, where does the board fit? What is their role in supporting governance? The board is not the be all end all of governance. So I found that framing useful. Secondly, this notion of a fiction. Yeah, you look at the origins of where we got this model from. There's not a lot written about it. Not a lot of people have thought about it, and they're not very strong. It's pretty shaky. The short story, and Yvette alluded to this, it's derived from a corporate shareholder model where shareholders have an equity stake, a financial stake in an enterprise. And secondly, from large philanthropic trusts, which were set up from people who had accumulated a lot of money, appropriating it or expropriated from people, and wanted a responsible group of people to look after this huge sum of money. And then we said, oh, hey, you want to start an under 12 youth soccer club? That's how you're governed. You want to start an environmental movement? That's how you're governed. You want to start a food bank, an arts group, a performing arts festival? That's how you're governed. So we applied this model for two very specific scenarios wholesale across a whole number of organizations. So not a really good starting place to begin with. That's the negative side of the story. On the more positive note, and we can get into this, and Martha and I may have a bit of an argument here, but I do believe currently the regulatory framework does allow groups to start to experiment with and do things a little bit differently. So I think there is a place for some optimism and some flexibility. But the number of groups that are out there that have done that are starting to experiment is pretty small. So I would say it's just in its infancy of groups starting to say, hey, we don't have to adopt this corporate shareholder model or this fiscal stewardship oversight model. We're just in early days, my sense, of groups starting in all those different sectors, starting to say, we don't have to do it exactly that way using these assumptions around what board governance looks like. We can do things a little bit differently. Last thing I'll say to highlight, this problem has gotten so big. Ontario Nonprofit Network, a member-based organization representing hundreds of groups in Ontario, they've recognized the flaws that Yvette just spoke about, and they've put concerted efforts towards a Reimagining Governance initiative. I'll put the link in the chat, but they are now doing a concerted effort to look at this question to say, okay, we're recognizing this is failing for too many people. We need to step back and say, what is a framework? What are tools? What are approaches that can better set up nonprofits up for success? Because the number of groups that are experiencing success in the current framework and assumptions is pretty dismal. That's it.
Awesome. Well timed. Very, very well timed. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And just flagging that someone asked in the chat for you pitched your TED Talk well. Somebody's like, what's the link to the TED Talk? Where is it? So I hopefully Angela or somebody can do that. I'd also just like to flag that Yvette and I in particular, although Yvette's doing a wider scope of research, I believe now, come at this. I certainly do utterly from an arts perspective, but I'm aware that there are people here who may not be thinking about arts. They may be thinking about different kinds of nonprofits, and Mark's presence is really, Mark, as I said to you, I will look to you and feel free to jump in to kind of broaden the lens a little bit, because my head is always going to be in arts related stuff. And last and certainly not least, and I'm assuming you want me to go to you, Martha, we'll give Martha a chance to weigh in for 3 minutes as a kind of opening statement game. You ready, Martha?
Don't you mean 30?
No, you get 3. You only get 3.
I guess I'm stuck with, if the board is a fiction, then what am I? And this is a strange place to be, because I'm the person who's often advising this fiction, and it's challenging because the variance across the nonprofit sector. You know, there's 83,000 charities in this country, more than that now, 29,000 nonprofits in BC alone. Golden, BC has the highest number per capita in BC. It's very strange how many of us seem to need to create new entities to sort of push a vision forward. And at the same time, it seems as if that's almost a prerequisite, whether it's a bank that's saying you have to incorporate in order to set up a bank account, or a funder saying we won't even entertain your application for funding if you're not incorporated. It imposes a whole set of requirements that, again, as I said, this motley crew of people are often ill-equipped to handle. And I'm not going to suggest that this is the answer because I don't think there is a single answer. I think there's two things. One, Mark, actually, there are people who've been ignoring the corporate structure for a long time and are not in trouble because they own their own organization and they see how they're working through it. The governance is shared. It genuinely is working. But it requires a high capacity to both understand what it is you're doing and why, the process and the purpose, and at the same time, the ability to say, okay, I'm going to check the boxes required by the state, and I'm not going to over worry them. At the same time, there's also very complex corporate structures, bylaws that have consensus-based decision-making built in, like the Quakers. Extraordinary work, not easy to work through, though, on a monthly basis for many organizations. So, you got 30 seconds. I'm working on it. So I don't know if that was the good or the bad or the ugly, but I think there's a lot of good things that are happening. We just don't know how to tap into it. And I guess the solution is, I really think it's time for funders to be opening up how they understand these requirements and stop insisting that they have to function within this very narrow construct.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. And that's actually, I think, a terrific segue. So as I said, the first chunk, and I'm going to say maybe you guys 10 or 15 minutes here is our kind of broad for these kind of two broad questions to have some conversations about that so that we can make sure we have time to hit some of the specific questions that came in from folks who are participating. Just a reminder too, and you guys have already started to do this, that my sense, as I said when we were planning, that as we talk about what's working and not working and the challenges, that examples, whether anonymous or not, specific examples of things I think are generally really helpful for people, just to kind of concretize things that can sometimes feel abstract when we talk about them in these kinds of forums, just putting that out there. So the first basic question, it's not a genius question or anything. It's literally what we're talking about, what's working and what's not working. And if we can kind of try to hit both, like, but go wherever you want to go with this. Mark, do you want to grab that first?
I'll just quickly reinforce what Martha actually said at the outset, that this presumption or assumption that we need to recruit board members who conventionally have such amazing accreditation, like they're lawyers or accountants or whatever, so they can go in a room and make all the decisions informed by all their brilliant credentials. Whereas to say, and really that assumption, part of that comes from the origins in philanthropic trust, to say we need a really responsible group of people to do fiscal oversight. The groups doing it well, boards have consciously, like Martha alluded, there are groups doing this that have gone beyond, that are ignoring corporate shareholder, this myth around corporate shareholder accountability. And they've said, no, we don't need the expertise in the room. Let's go and find somebody with that expertise, or let's go to staff and talk to them. And not just for a 15-minute presentation as part of our board meeting, but let's find out who has the expertise and get it. And we don't have to have them sitting in a permanent role on the board. We can just go talk to those people in the community, get that information. So as a board, we don't have to sit in a room, make all the decisions. We can just pose the question, who's best, who out there is best equipped to answer this? Go and find them and facilitate some other group or individual to answer the questions for us.
Can I follow up on that, Mark, and ask you? Okay, in that case, like it's a board that's not going. It has to be this cookie cutter thing of those corporatized kind of definitions of what board members are meant to do. What are those boards, those successful boards, doing if they're not doing that?
If they're not getting it, well, so one example, and actually this is in the Metro Vancouver region, a coalition that got together to tackle homelessness in a particular municipality. They recognized right away that they're going, this is beyond us, this issue is so complex, we're not going to have the answers. So the people on paper as the board, they kept it to 3 and they called them table officers. And they said, we're going to have a broad membership and we're going to do governance by having every 2 months meetings of the entire membership where we get all the members and we hear from them. And we as board members, and again, they use the term table officers, we're just going to convene the meetings. We're going to keep notes. We're almost administrators legally on paper. And then we're also going to make sure the boring stuff, as I call it, is taken care of. But we're going to empower the group of members of this broad coalition to tackle homelessness with governance and decision-making power. So that's one example, I guess, of doing it differently.
That's great. That's awesome. Yvette, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that is, Mark, is like people who are building governance models beside the legal things that they need to do, the table officers, the check boxes. And that I think is the way forward, because while we wait for the government to release us from the bonds of, the corporations model, so that we have a governance model that is working for us. When you go to the Canada Council and you are judged on your mandate, mission, vision, you're judged against your own mandate, mission, vision. We are doing this, this, and this, and your jury looks at that and how well you are fulfilling those things. And I think if we should be allowed to do that with our governance as well inside our theaters. What worries me about that checkbox model is we end up in this thing of like the pendulum of like just checking the boxes and nobody doing governance, or else everybody trying to get all in the business. Like I spend half of my days these days talking to people about how to fix their board, how to get more representation on their board, how much time they spend managing their board. And in my research, what I found is like so many managers, administrators are spending 35 to 80% of their time managing their board. And we're having a hard time breaking free of the idea of what that is. So it's like make work at the board table, and these agenda that are like all of this stuff that has to be prepared by staff in order to get the board to understand what it is doing. And I think for me, that's the biggest disconnect, is like a board of directors that does not understand what it is serving, which is in my case, the theater. And we've seen all the things that fall into that in the abyss there, like artistic directors who will not have a performance review because they say their board, who is a corporate-ish board, lawyers, doctors, accountants, are not artists and therefore cannot assess the performance of the artistic director. That's not one. I've heard that like several times. And so that abyss just keeps growing between what the board thinks its responsibility is and what the theater or arts organization is actually doing. And that space between the two just grows and grows. And so few boards of a certain size have any artists on it. They have very few people of color. And when they go to put those people on, they don't do it in a meaningful way. So I'm all for the idea of, I think that's the only way forward at this point, is creating the governance model that you want. But I worry that just checking boxes is not part of the governance model. Like this is where for me the gap occurs, which is why I want to actually change the legislation.
So for you, it becomes actually like your focus is on legislation itself, as opposed to the work we, or most of us here in the Zoom room, are able to do in relationship to the organizations that we either work for or collaborate with. Is that correct? Well,
it has created, like, that need to be incorporated has created everything else around it, which Martha referred to. You can't get a bank account, you can't get charitable status, you can't take donations, you can't, like you can't get funding, all the things you cannot do unless you are incorporated. And as soon as you have that, everybody starts making these bylaws that nobody can read, and then policies that nobody can read. I belong to an organization that is a community grassroots organization connecting art and community, and all of their propaganda is in language that nobody can read or understand. So one of the first things I'm doing in that is starting to translate that into language so that the board understands what our policies are for the organization. Right.
That's great. And unsurprisingly on this question, Martha wants to weigh in. Martha, yeah, go ahead.
Have to unmute myself. I just can't agree more with what Yvette just said. I think that the legislative model needs to change in a way to give us permission to do some of the stuff that we know needs to happen. And it is adherence to a way of doing things that we know. I mean, you know, I gave 300 workshops on the New Societies Act, and repeatedly people would look at me blankly when I said, do you even know where your bylaws are? It's like, they don't, you know, have you read them? Well, no. Why would I read them? Because when you read them, they might actually have some meaning to you. And we get very attached to, oh, no, we can't touch that. The number of small grassroots community-based organizations where a board has said to me, oh, we're a Carver board. I'm like, no, you're not. Why in the world would you choose to be, or even think you are a Carver model? I don't even know what that is. I'm not a governance expert. Sorry?
I was just gonna ask, what's a Carver? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, well, Carver model is that model where the sole function of the board is to set policy. It has absolutely no connection to day-to-day operations, which of course you don't want your board micromanaging you as staff. That's absolutely fine. And your board have a level of accountability and they need to be engaged. And I've only seen Carver models in large organizations like the YWCA of Vancouver, which has a very robust internal middle management, well-trained, well-resourced bunch of folks. There really isn't necessarily a lot for the board to do. But when you're a 4-staff organization, arts organization under $500,000, I'm sorry, but expecting your 5-member, 7-member, 10-member board to somehow be completely divorced from what is going on at some level managerially is just ridiculous.
Great, thank you. And I wanna just connect this to something that I just happened to notice randomly on the chat, which I think is maybe relevant. Like I've always been, in relationship to who's on our board and what the board looks like and what we imagine its role is. And I've always, been shocked that TransCanada Mountain Pipeline or whatever has never asked me to be on their board to provide all the useful insight from the performing arts sector that I would no doubt be able to offer. And there is this, and it's Marietta Kozak's comment about that we have boards, in which the word she describes as amateurs, i.e. people who are not in our field, and the de facto response, and again, this is an arts lens here, but the de facto response is, well, of course it has to be because you can't manage yourselves. I'm wondering if that feels like a relevant kind of point that's just come from the chat.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that is the huge problem, is we're asking people who know nothing about the business we're asking them to be our bosses. We're inviting them to the board. We're teaching them how to be the boss of us. And then we're giving them the power to be the boss of us. And they are volunteers, which is the thing. They are volunteers. And it's a great idea. Volunteerism is so important, but how does that translate when you are the boss of the professionals? So the amateurs are the boss. I agree, it is, even if they are interested at all. Even if you are invested in theater and you think it's a great idea, how does that make you qualified to be the boss of the arts organization? And so often, you know, people leave that at the door, leave those things at the door. And then it's great when it's working. But as we've seen recently in a bunch of situations, it fails for whatever reason. Again, it's a lack of communication between the board and the community that goes through the theater or the arts organization. So the lack of communication, and we've seen it with, you know, Soul Pepper, where the women had to go around the board eventually to the press to get some kind of answer. We've seen it, you know, Push, unfortunate example, but nobody goes on a board really. I think everybody goes on with the best of intentions. And while times are good, it's fine. But but when there is a crisis, when there is something, if you have not been given the information, if you don't know how to oversee this organization, if you don't know how to read a financial, then the community is howling. The board of directors should resign. And if I'm a board member, I'm like, I agree, I'm out of here. So there is no response. This is where my fiction theory comes in, because the board of directors as a volunteer can leave. And be like, you're right, I didn't do that well, and I'm not equipped to do this, so I'm gone, bye. And then who is left responsible? Who is accountable? And this is where my thesis has moved to, is like moving from the idea of a fiction to actual accountability. Like, where is the accountability? And if you're on a board, I will stop in a second. If you're on a board of directors that is only about outcome accountability, which is bums and seats, subscribers, bricks and mortar, you don't know anything about process. You don't know anything about how we get to the place where the theater is only showing white work by white men, where there are no roles for women, where there's no people of color on the stage, where women are being assaulted and have no recourse within. There's so many, you know, you don't know anything about how things got done, and therefore you cannot be responsible for it.
Can I chime in on something Yvette just prompted with me? Like,
please.
That vision of saying, you know, what is it? So aside from filling the check boxes, to say, hey, for us, for the organization, the space that we're in, what is our goal when it comes, we've got our mission. So, okay, based on that, what is our goal in governance, and where does community ownership reside? Where does accountability or social accountability lie? A lot of the regulatory frameworks come from an assumption that nonprofits and charities have to have some kind of relationship or accountable to the public, which I would argue is not necessarily true for every single nonprofit in the universe. It's true for some, not for all necessarily. So to have that question, say, what's our goal in governance? And then based on that, to say, recruiting board members, okay, here's what our goal in governance is. Maybe it's to empower the community. One of the questions for today was, is the current board model the best way to get a group of people to move towards a shared vision? I'd say, oh my gosh, no. But imagine if a group of people started there to say, what's our shared vision based on our mission for governance? And then, okay, who's in the room that we need to do that? But related, I want to go back to the legislation thing really quickly. I go back and forth on that one because legislation is part of the problem. But if you use the example of volunteers on boards, the Societies Act, you can make provisions to pay board members, but then you have funders getting in there saying, whoa, okay, we know you're allowed on the Societies Act to get funding from us, non-starter. And my question is why? Like, why? We assume people get paid, they're going to become raging capitalists all of a sudden. Well, if you're looking at including people who from diverse populations in governance, probably they may need some financial support, but it's not legislation, it's funders saying, oh, by the way, here's a footnote, you have to have a provision in your bylaw that you can't pay directors right now. And that's not Societies Act, that's not legislation.
That's awesome, Mark. And yeah, so some process accountability from me here. I saw Yvette go, and she wants to say something, and then we'll go to you, Martha, and then we're going to need to turn to kind of like what your guys' perceptions of a function of better governance model might look like. Go ahead, Yvette.
Yeah, no, I'm going to pass on to Martha because Mark said so many good things that I don't want to get all in his business.
Okay, go ahead, Martha.
Oh Lord, now I forgot what I was going to say.
Perfect. That's good facilitation right there. Okay, cool. I have a quick question. This is me being quick on my feet, but it came up for me earlier and I remember it, which is Yvette and Mark, maybe to some extent in the wider lens, but I'm really curious, and I'll come back to you in a sec, Martha. I'm really curious, like, and it's really also for the funders here who are attending, but it's like, if in your Canada Council or Arts Grant or whatever community services grant, you said, this is how we're going to do our governance, this is how our board's going to work, would they be able to say, cool, or would there be penalties for that?
I think that I actually think that that's the way we move forward through this to break the logjam, which is this. And I think it has to be an Indigenous organization who goes, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And have someone tell us, no, you have to be incorporated, and have the Indigenous org say, no, that's against my constitutional right. Like, you're colonizing me, so get off of it. And then that has to move through the courts, and then we can break it in that way. So we actually, there is a way, I think, to do it. The point I wanted to go back to that Mark had made, that is that the thing that we're talking about, how do we find the group of people to govern our organization, is the way all of these organizations started. So we've just lost our way along the way. Like, nobody got together to build a board of directors. They got together because they believed in making plays about Canadian theater, or they believed in making dance about an Indigenous community. And everybody started there. And somehow we grew into this monster that has disconnected the people who started it in the first place and served as the first directors, and have become like lawyers and people with checkbooks and people who don't even necessarily come to see the work.
Martha, you were nodding rapidly. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the thing about the monsters is that it's over many decades, we've reinforced the monsters instead of going back to, I guess, our roots in a certain sense. As someone who came out of grassroots social justice work, well, 35, 40 years ago, starting nonprofits, I totally get that. And I think that, so, you know, the thing about paying directors comes up a lot. And this is what I wanted to mention, which I think also goes directly to the point that you're making, Yvette, which is that there's actually quite a number of nonprofits that do remunerate directors. It's just that they have to do it for their activities that are not as directors. And particularly in Indigenous-led organizations that I've worked with in this province, who bring in elders to sit as directors of societies, they pay them as a component of being an elder, if you will, or being a leader in the community, because they have that community accountability and they're bringing skills to the society. They have them under contracts for services. And thus, they're not actually getting paid as directors. Now, I think this might be a little questionable in certain circumstances. I can imagine an independent arbiter, neutral or otherwise, looking at this and thinking, well, I think that's contrary to the gaming, or we're a registered charity. Surely that's not allowed. You know, you're not at sufficient arm's length. I think that Indigenous folks could argue up that problem away virtually instantaneously because of the level of community accountability that is invested in each of the persons who are on that board. They represent the nation. They're Treaty 7, every community and urban Indigenous are in one of the organizations, and they are all representative and take seriously their accountability to the community. The difference is that they are accountable to communities that are not, each and every member of that community is not a member of that organization. This enables them to go back to those communities and speak to those communities and be accountable to those communities. And they aren't struggling with this massive membership base either, which has its own problems. So
great. Thank you, Martha. And that's great. And I mean, other people who are not talking like we are, we're probably aware of this, but just to draw everybody's attention to the really excellent conversations happening simultaneously, parallel conversations happening in the chat right now. I was just glancing at them and they're really, really terrific. So in the interest of time, because I don't want to keep us too much past one. We'll go a bit past one PST, but for me, an hour on Zoom is generally lots. I want to turn to the question of like what does an improved governance model or an utterly different framework look like, and to each of the three of you, before we move into the questions that were posed to us in advance and the ones that have come up on the chat. Martha, just an alert to you to be ready for those coming. But I'm wondering if we could do that. What does the improved model look like? As a, just, you don't have to do a big long thing, like just sort of ability from you guys. Like what are the components? It doesn't have to be the whole thing. It's just like, what are the components? What are the principles? What are the fundamentals? What are the tiny little specifics? Mark, are you up for having a go at that?
Oh goodness.
I mean, if it's a shitty question, just ignore me.
No, it's a good question, but it's a long story.
Right.
Gotta keep this short. I mean, I think in part, and this is where I struggle with the legislation, because it kind of goes back to so every organization by default, they have to have a constitution, and to do that, they have to have purposes. Wouldn't it be cool, and going back to Yvette's prompt around communicating something to funders to say, hey, here's our goals as an organization, and then based on that, here's our goal in governance, or here's who we think we are accountable to. Because that question is very different for every organization. And all of you on this call, you're all treated the same as though your accountability is to X, and everyone just moves on. But it's like, well, we'll pause there. Who are we at? Where does community ownership over this thing reside? And so if our framework could reinforce every single group just to pose that question, and then to say, based on that, two things. One, based on that, who should be part of a board or whatever group to get the right people involved, to bring that vision and governance into reality? And what practices should we adopt? Board, you can put anything you want in your bylaws or policies around how you make decisions. Many groups just default to Robert's rules because, like Martha says, we've like doubled down on this monster over decades. There's so many other approaches out there. But what groups, where they get into trouble is they throw out Robert's rules and they don't have a conscious conversation about what they're replacing it with, right? So to say, yeah, what's our goal in governance? Are we looking to empower some community, be accountable to some community? Or no, are we just here to steward a mountain of wealth as a philanthropic trust, which are totally different things? And then based on that, what are practices that could reinforce that?
That's a terrific answer. Thank you, Mark. Yvette?
Yeah, as I've said before, self-determined governance model, a community of interest, like that's who should be governing us. And if there is no community that is interested in what we're doing, then why do we exist? And a little bit to Martha's point about, paying elders and those things, it's like, at the risk of sounding all Justin Trudeau, like, stop looking for the loopholes. I want to stop having to look for loopholes to do the work. It makes me untruthful. It makes my organization untruthful. I would rather make the thing that allows us all to be truthful and invested, and so that I don't have to make a loophole or go looking for a loophole in order to do the thing that I know is right.
That's great. Mark, it looked to me like you were about to respond to something. Is that true, or was I just reading your lips?
It wasn't necessarily a response, but I just wanted to add something that I think is really, well, Yvette did prompt it. I see many are going to just get locked into a conventional agenda format. Regardless of the framework you're in, the limitations, just the current group of people you've got, step back and say, what should we be talking about right now? What's the most important thing we should be talking about right now? And what's the specific question we should be talking about? Don't put topics on agendas, put questions. A topic is not good. Like, okay, we're going to fundraise for the whatever. What question are we actually asking? Or instead of a topic being the festival, well, what about the festival are we talking about? And when it comes to the festival, what's the most important conversation? And to ask everybody involved, possibly beyond the board, that question, just a really tangible practice. Sorry.
Sorry, Martha, I'm going to jump in just quickly, which is it just that feels like something to me that in the search for things that will be helpful to staff and to the people running the organizations, that kind of practice as a former organizational leader, I think, oh, if the board did that, that'd be really helpful. Like if they were like, you know what I mean? Sorry, Martha, go ahead.
I think I agree with all of what you're saying. I have to say, though, that one of the underlying reasons that doesn't happen is because to use an overused word, the capacity of the organization is so stretched, there's just not enough money. The bottom line for me at some level, and I don't want to be overly reductive about this, but it's that there's no money for board training, real board training. I don't mean board training in how to be a freaking Carver board. I mean board training in basic employment. How do you be the employer? What is the difference between being a contractor and an employee? Who are, respectful workplaces? Hello, how do you expect an organization with a tiny budget and 2 or 3 staff to manage a complaint of respectful workplace issue, in whatever way, shape, or form? It's a completely unreasonable expectation in the for-profit world, in the corporate world. These people are paid. There are paid professionals to assist, to resolve conflicts in the workplace. There's a privacy officer, so you don't need to constantly worry about whether or not you're doing it right. Your ED is not doing everybody 5 jobs. They're doing 1 job, and part of it is there's an expectation that, as I said at the outset, that somehow this motley group of volunteers are simply going to morph into doctors, lawyers, and accountants. And I think that is really unrealistic. And if we do want to see change, first, we have to empower people to make those demands. Funders need to hear them and stop insisting that everybody has to fit the model of the large organization that seems to be fine, which actually isn't if we go with what's his name in Quebec. Sorry, I lost the name. The Quebecois theater artist who's very well supported by everybody, who managed to be on the wrong side of just about any sentiment. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
Great. So I'm getting I think it's time for us to move to people's specific questions. And so Martha, if you could be ready for that. And just panelists, I got a little side note from Angela, just letting know that people are expressing generally like a desire, if we can be really specific in terms of examples, that would be helpful. I'm doing my best, but I'm not, just to put that out, like actual specific things. But I think the questions that we got from people might also lead us in that direction a little bit. Martha, do you want to throw us one?
Sure. Well, one of the questions that came up was, how do we get away from the donor model? And I think that this hasn't really come up as yet, is this idea where the board is there to fundraise, whether as individuals give money, or we create a 16-member board who's made up primarily of people who are going to raise money for the organization.
Mark or Yvette, do you want to jump in on that one?
I ran a small organized, sorry, Mark.
I was saying no.
I ran a small organization that, small, so like under $1 million. And the board of directors always had in this, like there was always, when I got there, this line in the budget for fundraising that the board never did, and insisted that it would be in the budget. And I just took it out. I was like, in certain levels of organizations, it's crazy to expect your board, actually, I know this about big ones too, to raise money. If that's what you've brought them on the board to do, unless they're all Peter Herndorf, it's not what people do, right? I know board members on big organizations with massive, massive amounts of money who cannot write a check. So it just feels to me like it's another part of my fallacy. Like boards don't raise money. And so I think the moment that we're in this change moment, everything is going to shrink. I think all the organizations are going to have to get smaller and rethink the way they're doing business. And it is the opportunity to move away from that. We need someone with deep pockets on the board. it is an actual opportunity, because the subscribers aren't coming back. The theaters aren't going to be full again. Like, we're a long, long way from that. And so this is the moment where we can reimagine the way we want our organizations to be. And part of that is that donor model, where we're inviting people on the board who we think are going to raise money for us, who aren't going to raise money for us, at least at a certain level.
Do you know, I will jump in and comment on that one, because yeah, I think that's one of these myths and assumptions that got applied blanket wholesale across the whole sector, that was very specific to philanthropic trusts. That's a very reasonable expectation if you're going to be managing tens of millions of dollars, is like, bring some money. For an under 12 soccer league, no, you're not, your job is not fundraising. Like, that's ridiculous, right? It's just like insane. So moving beyond that, but actually as a tangible example of, and actually it's in the Metro Vancouver region, a arts group, a festival society, not Push, okay, but I'm not going to say who. They wanted a group of people to financially support what they do. So they created a leadership council, and they knew the folks that on that council were never going to want to meet. And the artistic director did not want to empower that group with any kind of decision making. So the leadership council meant, to be on the council, you need to bring a certain amount of money to our organization. And hey, when the festival happens, I'll bring you around and shake your hand. You can shake some hands with some artists and stuff. And that's it. And we're going to meet once a year and have some wine. And that's how they kind of dealt with fundraising in a way that didn't interfere with the board piece. One thing I wanted to say, prompted by you, Marcus, in this reference to tangible, specific suggestions, Martha mentioned the Carver model. And I'd encourage groups to get beyond abstract definitions of what governance or board responsibilities are for your respective organization. Far better, make a list of all the functions in your organization: marketing, communications, production, the event, human resource, whatever. List them all out, and then be really clear. Okay, what is the board's involvement for each of those? For some organizations in a startup, the board is doing all that stuff. Some organizations might start to have paid staff that could take some of that. And if you can clearly articulate and say, yeah, when it comes to the curatorial direction, board, you're out. That's our artistic director. But board, you're going to focus on these three other things. That list of things and how the board is involved will change, should change for an organization as over time, as the size of it changes. So don't get into these, oh, our board is a X board. That's meaningless. And everyone you say that to is going to interpret that in 19 different ways. Make a list. This year, here are the functions of the organization. Here's exactly how the board is involved in all of them. And then hopefully that avoids any misunderstandings about what the board is or should not be doing. Last thing I'll say, I just saw a comment about consent agendas, is try to structure meetings so they're not used for passing along information. Meetings should be for discussion. So if you have an agenda that lists off a bunch of stuff that's just for information, you're wasting face-to-face time. So again, the prompt for creating your agendas is to say, not what's important to the organization, it's what should this group of people be talking about in person with each other live, which is very different from, hey, check out this YouTube video, here's some information.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mark. And I will say, I think that that's just from experience that those of us who start cultural organizations, often the board is just something you add on. Like, it's not that the board was doing it at the beginning, it's the person who started or the people who started it. And suddenly you're like, oh, I got to get a board, like, because I got to fill out all these forms. Great, Martha, I think we should I'm going to wrap us by 1:15 Pacific time, everybody, just so you're aware. Martha, can you throw us another question?
Well, one of the questions that came up when we sent around the registration, people registering, a lot of questions around how we address systemic racism and decolonization. And I think that area is coming up more and more. And I think, I don't think it's a question that is only related to, say, paying directors. There's been quite a conversation over the chat about paying directors and why we would pay people. We are asking over and over and over again to come on our boards in an effort to diversify and why they should be paid, perhaps. I think it's a bigger conversation as well about how the structure of a board is inherently systemically biased or racist or whatever.
Yeah, and I was smiled. I don't know if I actually smiled, but smiled inside of that when you were like when you said yeah, and now it's like everybody's trying to find the brown people to put on their boards. Do you like what's your thinking around this big important question that also feels related to what you talked about this moment and the challenge of this moment, but also the opportunity of this moment to in the face of many of us not doing what we would normally be doing to think hard about some of these things.
Well, it's who is inviting people to the board, which, you know, I don't believe in. Who is inviting those people, and what check boxes do they have to be? So I have talked to people in the last week who have been invited to boards, but need to have like 6 referees, 2 employers, 2 employees, 2 colleagues to vote for them to be on this board. And I'm like, so they're not going to be inviting me. Like, who gets to say what the rules are about people who come onto the board? And when you sit in the room with the board, do they all look alike? So that's part of the problem. And in the effort to diversify, we're going out and finding people. So like if my board is, I want an accountant and I want a human resources person and I want someone with a big checkbook. Oh yeah, and we need some brown people. And what are they bringing to the table besides their brown skin? Which is very often nobody even asks, like nobody at the board levels asks why this person is being invited to the room. So that person can come to the room thinking they can make change and discover that they're only there for the brown skin, like tokenism, and be frustrated and leave into meetings because they're not being heard or they're being exotified or blah, blah, blah. Like all of this is what the problem with the structure is. So if you're not willing, and I've just talked to, you know, members of an organization that are working with their board to try and make it more inclusive, but they have no idea where to begin. The board of directors, because they look around the table and they see just themselves, and they're not even sure what it is they're supposed to be wanting. So the whole thing has to be broken down. It has to come apart. It's not going to help us just to put brown people on boards if we're not willing to make the change, the deep structural change that makes everything about that organization more equitable.
Yeah, I'm going to just jump in briefly. So myself and Ravi Jain, sort of another established theater artist and the brown identified theater artist in the country, were asked to join the Simimage Prize board last year, very much because of, I mean, also for legit reasons. I actually think it's a really great board, and the values are really clear and really terrific. But you know, all this stuff come up at letters and all that stuff, and we just Ravi and I just led a session with the board where we talked about the history of our experience, our perspective on the history of race and relationship to theater in Canada, particularly as we've experienced it over the last 20 or 30 years. And it was a really gratifying process. And what just struck us both, Ravi and I, was like, you know, all those board members, all white, were like, and mostly business people, they were so interested because they love us. Like, they're so like into what we think, and they were super interested. They knew absolutely nothing, unsurprisingly, absolutely nothing. And we had to do that work. It was us who had to do that work. And I'm actually not complaining about that. Because who the fuck else is, sorry, excuse my language, but who else is going to do it? Who else knows? Like who else has had that experience? And that's an interesting kind of like push-pull, because there's also a part of me that goes, you know, like everybody, like, why am I 30 years later after doing this for a long time? Like, why am I, but that actually is what, to me, in that context, felt really necessary. And in many ways was gratifying because we got a lot back. Sorry, I went on. Martha, go ahead.
Well, one of the questions I have for both of you and Mark is, you know, I see some of this as a generational issue. Like, I do think that there's, you know, I'm not, you know, there's a lot of issues around people not self-educating, and also our respective roles as educators at a certain age and time, and you know, you've been around long enough, people will look to you to give to do some of that. At the same time, though, I think my sense is that some of this is also coming from a very different generation from us, and the demands, and that there's a real tension there because there's a real, also a lack, an ahistorical piece there, right? I have 58 years on this planet. You have 30. Gee, that can be tension building as well, or 20, let's say 20, maybe not 30, 25, I don't know. But do you see a generational tug there, or push, or tension?
Well, can I jump in? Oh yeah, go ahead, Marcus.
No, go ahead. You go ahead. I'll say what I have to say after.
I was just going to say, some of these conversations and getting at what Martha's talking about, it kind of drives me crazy when organizations are going to contemplate equity work or anti-racism or decolonization and say our answer to that is start with the board. My is like, how's the rest of the organization? Like that, what we've talked about today is the board being one of the most dysfunctional elements. So, hey, that's going to be our starting place. Like, how's everything else doing at the organization? How do we as an organization contribute or not to perpetuating racism? And let's start there. And maybe the answer isn't to get someone who looks different from guys like me onto the board, but actually reaching out to communities to saying, we don't need folks to sit on the community. If we want to hear from youth, what you're talking about, Martha, the generational gap, let's just have a cool meeting twice a year in a room where we get them to set the vision for the organization. And that's it. That's all we ask. And we pay everybody, we give everybody a high five. And we've included different voices, but without asking them to come sit in a Robert's Rules meeting when the whole rest of the organization is oppressive and ridiculous. So there's just way more answers to that question than stick them on the board. Let's start with the whole organization, and we can include people in governance without sitting at the board table. The board can go out and talk to people. Newsflash. Sorry, I'm going on anyways.
No, that's great.
Talk to people? A board?
I know, right?
And I'm gonna, just because we are now coming up to 75 minutes and 1:15, I am, two things I just kind of want to jump in on here. One is to acknowledge Miles's comment in the chat. This is a terrible thing that, or a habit of mine, but just that I was using brown as a kind of, as I do, as a sort of semi-ironic thing to remember, and thank you for the reminder that when we're talking about marginalized people and people whose difference, whose supposed or defined difference has been constructed in this culture, not just talking about brown people, talking about LGBTQ plus people, talking about people with disabilities, talking about talking about class too, from my perspective, talking about the wide range of difference, so-called difference that defines how power works systemically in this culture and affects us all in a variety of different ways. So thank you, Miles, for that. I'm also, because I am gonna, with everybody's permission, start to wrap us here. I'm just gonna note again the extraordinary conversations happening in the chat and the resources that have been put there, which will be captured and passed on to everybody. And for me, one of the great frustrations, particularly with this one, and you know I've done a fair number of these, but particularly with this one, is the format does not actually allow conversation in a way that would be really helpful. There is so much knowledge and experience amongst all the folks here who showed up for this Zoom that wasn't really able to be voiced, so it all landed with us. And I would just, and I know this is true, that Martha's intention for PLEO and certainly Mark and Yvette's ongoing work is to actually have these conversations when it is actually possible for us to have these conversations in a way that is driven by the kind of principles that we're talking about here. It's what I crave and what I think we desperately need. So just to acknowledge that and thank everybody for willing to be kind of more like TV viewers for this conversation, because that's what we were able to manage. I'd like to thank Mark, Yvette, well, Martha, the organizer, but also Angela and her team so much. I've loved this in the midst of this shitstorm that has been the last few months in my life on the work and personal fronts. This opportunity to connect has been really, really amazing. And I think this is just so rich and there's so much work and conversation to be had. So thank you for including me in that. Martha, shall I hand it back to you for a final close?
Sure. Thanks, Marcus, for doing so much heavy lifting over the last several weeks in helping us to weave these words together into some sort of coherence. And thank you so much, Yvette, for writing, for thinking, and for contributing to this conversation. And Mark, for contributing, for standing up on a stage and talking stuff, because I'm not going to swear today. It's a genuine pleasure, honor, and this is the beginning of what I hope. Maybe we should make a series. We'll do a series of conversations, and maybe we'll do one specifically on, you know, what would be a traditional Indigenous governance model, and take it apart, and not in a bad way, but in the way of how can we learn? There's a lot of things we might be able to learn, and maybe we could do it by doing a series where we look at some of those models and inviting people to participate. Please subscribe to Pacific Legal Education Outreach. Please watch this space, National Network of Legal Clinics for the Arts. And we have an Ask a Law Student page. You can ask a law student the occasional question. We can't answer some, but they're doing their best to answer some questions. And let's keep the conversation going in our daily lives.
Great. Thank you, Martha. And I've been asked to give the final goodbye, just to say that there were lots in the chat, Martha, encouraging people. This session has been recorded. I believe PLEO will make it available to people for those who are asking. And I think it's very loudly and clearly heard the desire to go deeper into some of these things from Martha and the whole PLEO gang. So it's up to me to sign off. Thanks so much, everybody. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you for coming and joining us. And in Vancouver, it's sunny, so go outside if you're here, because that's what I'm gonna do. See ya, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.